Good morning and welcome. Never used one of these. I feel like a rock star. Good morning and welcome to this session of Silvopasture, planting for shelter and forage. First of all, I'd just like to say some words. This session is hosted by Pasture Livestock Association, and we're a 400-member association for certified grass-fed for life livestock. And we've got leaflets here, and we've got a stand in the main hall. Do come and find out more about us, and try and get one of the really cute little ear tag key rings, because they're really good fun. But there are lots of people here that are members, and we're good to chat to and see about how maybe pasture-fed could work for you. It certainly works with agroforestry, and we're going to be hearing first today from Dr. Lindsay Whistance. She's from the Organic Research Centre. Then we hear from Andrew Barber, who's from Scotland, and is going to talk about integrating trees and woodlands for livestock for shelter and shade and for multiple benefits. And then last of all from Chris Jones, and he'll tell us about his practical use and how he's integrating trees into his livestock farm. Thank you. I'll hand over to Lindsay.
Thanks very much. Good morning. It's fabulous to see a full room of people. So I'm going to talk about silvopasture from the animals side, and throughout the talk I may mention well-designed silvopasture, and what I mean by that is that all of the animals in this system have equal access to all of the resources within it. And before I start talking about trees, I just want to make a point about the animals themselves. And much of what an animal does on a daily basis is concerned with attaining, maintaining and regaining balance in some form, whether that be physical, social or emotional balance. And much of these things can be aided by the presence of trees within their environment. So if we talk about social behaviour initially, within a well-designed silvopastoral system, we find that social behaviour is more positive. Social cohesion is stronger. There is less aggression and less fear within herd members or flock members. If we take the example of cattle, we find that as a proportion of total behaviour, social licking increases to up to 80%, which is roughly double that of animals on open pasture. And there's some evidence to show that animals are also less fearful of human beings within a silvopasture environment, and this is attributed, at least partially, to them having something to hide behind. Okay, if we now look at social maintenance behaviours, every single day animals use a portion of that day maintaining their own bodies. And having something to scratch or rub against is really important for them, so that they can remove external parasites, grass seeds that might penetrate the skin, and also shedding of dead hair. And offering a variety of angles will enable them to do this job as well as they can. Additionally, now we're focusing more heavily on sheep that are selected for self-shedding. This becomes even more important for these animals. And I also include poultry in this, because although poultry use their beaks for preening, they do more of this under a tree canopy than on open pasture. Globally, the single most important thing the trees do is offer shade. And cattle are already looking for shade at around 21 degrees, of course depending on breed, coat colour, yield status. But in a well-designed silvopastoral system, we can reduce solar radiation by up to 58%, and the skin of the animals under these trees is reduced by 4 degrees, so quite a substantial benefit. And of course this buffering isn't just for the animals, it also works for the grasses themselves. And this isn't the Dehesa in Spain, this is Wiltshire last summer. I'm not going to spend too much time on the drawbacks of poorly designed systems where there is not equal access, But I just want to mention that if there is too little shade, animals will overcrowd, increasing the risk of disease, as well as death of vegetation and compaction of soil. In a well-designed silvopastoral system, animals will utilise their environment much more evenly. They will also maintain their normal behaviour patterns, so feeding is maintained, where in open pasture with no access to shade, they're more likely to switch to loafing behaviour. And in production terms, this can mean up to 3 weeks for animals to reach a target weight. And of course, what it also means, when they're using the landscape more evenly, they're also spreading resources more evenly. So potassium, phosphorus and nitrogen is spread better over the landscape. If we turn our attention to more inclement weather, trees can also provide a great deal of benefit as shelter against wind. And I think it's easy to not understand or to minimise the effect of wind on animal welfare. If, for example, we take an ambient behaviour, ambient temperature of 2 degrees, and then we add 15 kilometres, 15 mile an hour winds, the effective temperature then becomes -7 degrees, which is quite a difference. We can also see the benefits in cold weather and rainy weather, where here a canopy is perhaps better than a shelter belt or a tall hedge. And as a buffer, in winter it works very well, where the surface temperature can be raised by up to 6 degrees. And if these cows here don't look like they're in the rain, these are the cows over the road above, without any shelter. Of course, at the beginning of life, shelter also can play a huge role, and not just for the hider species such as deer and cattle, but also for follower species such as sheep. Providing good shelter can increase survival, lamb survival by a good 30%. And then it's no surprise, of course, that these lambs also do better, grow better, so they're not using energy to keep warm. If we turn our attention to trees as a feed source, if we're going to offer browse to animals, knowing what their browse heights are is quite important. For sheep, it's around 1.2 metres, for cattle, it's 2 metres, and for goats, it's non-existent. They're generally termed vertical grazers, and so we can see here the graph that's been created showing the annual diet composition for 4 species. I'll be focusing on the cattle, the sheep and the goat, but you can see in the top part is the trees and shrubs, and it's represented in all of their diets. This can vary quite a lot and does so in environments, for example, where trees, grasses and forbs are not thriving in hot weather, for example, or when the shoots of young trees are very tasty. And any cattle owner will probably recognise cattle going into a fresh field, and the first thing they do is check out the hedges. When they have even access to all of these resources, what they generally do is fill up in the morning, fill up in the evening, and use the middle of the day to be more selective in their feeding behaviour. So if we look at other ways of feeding trees, we can cut it and drop it fresh, and this is typically used in areas such as New Zealand in the dry periods where they're feeding willow and poplar. We can cut it and carry it and feed it fresh, or we can dry it or ensile it for later use. And this bottom image, this feed will be given to dairy goats. Traditionally in the UK, we have fed tree fodder. Elm and ash were traditional trees, as was holly in the winter time. And these bottom images are holly from the Stiper stones in Shropshire, which were kept for the miners who used to feed their cattle on these trees in winter. The fashion for feeding tree fodder was lost when we started feeding roots in the wintertime. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on this graph, but this is some nutritional work that was done in Norway, comparing the leaves of various tree species with meadow hay and red clover. And I've just highlighted the sugar, just to make it easier to see, but they compare very well indeed across the board. Some more up-to-date work looking at the nitrogen content. So along the bottom, you've got the crude protein, and along this x-axis, we've got the effective degradability of nitrogen, with the average, the mean lines as a cross in the middle. I'm not sure this works very well, but no. Okay. Up along the top, you've got the alfalfa and the ryegrass as comparisons, but it's very, very clear that mulberry is a standout, outstanding source of protein, but other trees compare very well. The one thing that alfalfa and ryegrass doesn't have, though, is the condensed tannins. And what condensed tannins do, they hold on to the protein. They sort of stick to the protein, preventing it being digested in the rumen. But it's later released in the abomasum. The more acidic abomasum breaks down those links, so effectively releasing high-quality rumen bypass protein. The other thing that the presence of condensed tannins does is reduce the methane that's coming off the animal. And the methane produced from willow is half that comes off lucerne. And of course, what this does for the animal is reduces the risk of bloating. This is some work that's done on the mineral content of leaves. And when they were tested as fresh samples, and they were also tested as dry samples. And what we found, let's see if these come up. Oh, okay. Let me just start saying that some samples are very high in certain chemicals. They're all very well represented. So this is, the one on the left is the fresh elm, and the one on the right is the dried elm. And in some instances, the level of minerals are almost double in the dried. And this perhaps presents a really good opportunity for offering mineral substitutes or mineral supplements. So I've picked out some of the minerals here with the goat willow. The brownie coloured mark is phosphorus, and with the Salix viminalis, a variety of willow, the calcium is extremely high, as is zinc. And the zinc is quite important in organic farming, certainly for pigs, but it's also important for every single animal in aiding skin integrity, preventing diseases and penetration. So if we look at the palatability of different trees, this has been assessed for the Woodland Grazing Toolbox. And I want to make a point about palatability, because most people generally are concerned with one single aspect of palatability, which is the hedonistic sense, the taste of trees. Of course, this is only part of it. It's a much more subtle relationship between the taste of something and post-ingestive feedback. So what we find is that palatability can actually go up and down depending on the needs of the animal. And an example of this is a study that was done in Mediterranean countries, where when lambs are born, there's very little green grass, which means that there's also very little vitamin E, making these lambs susceptible to white mussel disease. So some researchers set about studying whether the lambs would eat a less palatable or a less tasty feed in the form of browse, which is green at this point, but very high in tannins, whether they would be able to eat the less tasty tannin-rich feeds. They didn't use browse when they did the test, but what they did do was take a group of lambs and give them a very palatable feed. And then they took half of the lambs and made them deliberately deficient in vitamin E, and then introduced a much less tasty feed that's high in vitamin E. What they found was the lambs with needing the vitamin E immediately switched to the less tasty feed. And then as soon as they'd regained a balance in vitamin E, they reverted back to the tastier feed. This is actually nothing new for animals. We're learning all the time, but if any of you farm in moorlands and have seen animals very short on landscapes that are short with phosphorus and calcium, this is actually not something that's different. These animals seem to know when they're lacking, and they go. If they can't find a natural resource, they may find for them an unnatural resource. We call this pica. Don't think they have a name for it. So if we turn our attention to, I mentioned the presence of condensed tannins. Another really positive benefit of feeding feeds with condensed tannins is the control of parasites. The condensed tannins work on the parasites on the infective stage, the L3 stage. They inhibit their maturing, so many of them simply don't mature. And those that do mature are smaller in size, so they produce fewer eggs for the next generation. And some work done in New Zealand on both sheep and goats has shown that using condensed tannins in the feed can reduce worm burdens by as much as 50%. One of the other things, of course, that offering browse does is it removes the animals from the area in which they're most susceptible to ingesting parasites. This is about 6 inches, 15 centimetres from the ground. So if they're feeding on browse, they're simply not picking up parasites. In terms of medicinal behaviour, some of the best evidence we have of medicinal behaviour in animals is from primates. And this chimpanzee is eating the berries of phytolacca. In human medicine, phytolacca berries are used to treat rheumatism, to treat skin complaints, and to treat soreness linked with lactation. We're a bit thinner on the ground with farm animals, but there's plenty of anecdotal evidence. And the cow in the top left-hand corner comes from a farm in Wisconsin where the farmer feeds his animals free choice bicarbonate of soda, which acts as a very good buffer, pH buffer for the rumen. What he finds is that when his cows transition from fresh pasture to ensiled winter feed, which is more acidic, their intake of bicarbonate of soda increases dramatically. And perhaps the best evidence we have in terms of livestock is a study carried out in Bristol on broilers. Nothing to do with trees, but what they did do was provide these broilers with their normal feed and a second feed, which is their normal feed laced with painkillers. And then they watched what they did. And they found that the lame broilers all fed on the laced feed with the painkillers, and that their intake of this feed increased with the increasing severity of their lameness. The healthy broilers did not take this feed. There's been some work done on sheep looking at whether they can tell the level of salicylic acid in willow. Willow is an extremely good source. Actually, salicylic acid is present in most plants, but it's in extremely high levels in all willows. But they wanted to see if they could tell the difference between willow varieties, so they offered them 2 willow varieties, one with a much higher level, and they found that the sheep all chose the one with the higher level of salicylic acid. Now, given that salicylic acid has pain-killing properties, it may be that, but it also has anti-inflammatory properties, so it's not clear why they were choosing that. But the important thing here, I think, is that they were able to distinguish between the two. And I think these 2 bits of information, the fact that animals recognise their pain, are looking for pain-killing opportunities in their feed, and are able to distinguish between less and good sources of this, I think offer us hope that if we provide animals with a diverse environment, including trees, then they can look after themselves much better than perhaps we think they can. So, thank you.